Yep, we're on. Yeah, boy.
Hi guys, welcome along to a bit more info on stick baiting and kind of the ins and outs of it and what it all is. So what is stick baiting? You know, we predominantly do it here for kingfish, but you can catch things like snapper and kahawai on them as well. Overseas they catch things like GTs, giant trevally, tuna, all sorts of other stuff. But today we're going to kind of focus a bit more on catching the yellowtail kingfish on them, because it's an awesome way to fish. It's real visual, you see them smash the lure and it's heaps of fun. So what's a stick bait? A stick bait looks something like this, which essentially looks like a fish. You can see the kind of profile to it. And the whole idea of fishing these is that we fish them in that surface area. Some are floating, some are sinking, and we'll get into that. And we retrieve them back towards us. And we're trying to make them essentially look like an injured bait fish. We talked about floating versus sinking. There's a floating lure, there's a sinking lure. They look pretty similar, and obviously there's lots of different shapes and models out there, but you won't really know the difference until you fish them. So talk to your guys at your local tackle stores and they'll be able to give you all the info on whether they're floating and sinking and kind of rigging and stuff as well. We've seen the lures. How are we going to fish them? Usually we're using rods that are 7'6" to kind of up to 8'2" in length, because they're casting rods and we need to cast these lures at distance. We use spinning reels because obviously again they're designed to cast. And we use braid, not mono. Main reason is so we can keep in touch with these lures. What we're trying to do is cast them at distance and then retrieve them back towards us. And as we retrieve them back towards us, we get that S shape that they'll make. The floating lures, they'll sit kind of yay far above the water when we pause. The sinking lures, they'll either suspend or they'll slightly sink as we pause. And there's two different times you'll use them. Floaters are usually really good in calmer conditions. Sinkers come into their own in rough conditions because you don't need to control them as much. Where are we going to find these kingies? You know, we talk about fishing these, but we've got to get to these areas that hold them. So what are we looking for? We're looking for places like headlands that have got a bit of whitewash around them, any reef structure that's breaking the surface or just under the surface. We're looking for schools of fish that are being pushed up. You'll see them splashing and being pushed up, and that's quite often kingies hitting them. Or sometimes you're also looking for schools of fish like trevally and kahawai that are on the surface, and you'll see them sounding, so you'll see that white water as they dive. So quite often kingies are on the outside or under them, and they're trying to pick off any that are kind of stray or trying to get away. When we talk about stick baits, they come in wooden versions and they come in plastic molded versions. The wooden versions are usually unrigged, so they don't come with any hooks, whereas the molded versions usually come with treble hooks. The reason for trebles is that stick baits are designed to be used with trebles because the trebles add weight to them and help them swim in the right way. You'll see this one's got treble on the belly and a single on the back. We can fish them with singles as well, but always be aware that singles are lighter, so it might just change the way they swim a bit. How are we going to fish these? We've talked about, we've got the stick bait, we've got the gear, but what do I do? So what we're going to do, you're aiming to cast these lures either into that areas we've talked about, on the sides of those bait fish that are on the surface, into that white water, or around those edges of that reef structure, or over the top of it, because that's where those areas where those kingies are hunting. So sometimes those casts will be 50, 60, 70 meters, so they can be at a long distance, because quite often it's too dangerous to get the boat in there, so we're casting into that structure. So we cast the lure out. If it's a floating lure, it's going to hit the surface and then it's going to pop up. If it's a sinking lure, it's obviously going to sink. So once we've cast it, we're going to wind up the slack in that line until we come tight with the lure, and then we're going to give that rod a nice long sweep. And what it'll do is it'll pull the lure down if it's a floater. If it's a sinker, it's already down there, and it'll give it this big S shape. Once you pause, that floater will come back to the surface, or the sinker will just sit there. So you're going to wind up that slack and sweep, and then again you'll wind up that slack and sweep. So what you'll quite often find is with a floating lure, you'll fish it a little bit slower because you want it to pop. That's the time the kingfish regularly hit it, because it looks like it's trying to get away when it does that S, and then it's easy to get when it kind of rests and pauses like it's almost giving up. Sinking lures we can quite often fish a lot faster because they're staying under the water, and we can keep that S going just with faster sweeps. How do you know whether you're doing that retrieve right or not? A classic with floating stick baits, if you're retrieving it as you're doing that big long stroke and your stick bait's flipping out of the water and sliding on its side, you're doing it too fast. Okay, so you need the head of this stick bait to dive under and then do this S shape, and it'll pop back up. Now quite often that'll leave a little bubble trail or a little splash as it goes in, but if your stick bait is coming flying out of the water or it's sliding around, it looks unnatural and the kingies won't want to know about it. And it's a common fault we make when we're trying to stick bait, because we're all excited, we've seen kingies busting, and we try and go fast and it comes flying out of the water. So just try and control yourselves and slow it down a bit and let him do his thing. Different stick baits, like I say, have different actions, and some are wider S's, some are slimmer, but they're all designed to kind of do that style of fishing that gives that S and makes it look like an injured bait fish. So I'm holding a stick bait outfit here that we've been using today, and we've caught a few kingies on it. We've had a really good day and the conditions have been bang on. We talked about fishing braid so we can keep in touch with it, but you still want to be fishing a leader. Okay, so on here you'll see I've got a mono leader, and usually you'll fish mono leaders. You can fish fluoro as well, but mono's just a bit more supple and will allow the lure a bit more freer action. With this, obviously we're casting pretty heavy gear. The braid we're using is normally minimum 50 pound, up to 80, sometimes 100, depending on what you're fishing for. Okay, we don't use a lot of knots like you would use for snapper fishing and your regular stuff with mono to swivels and things like that. Normally with this style of fishing, we'll use a knot either called an FG knot or a PR knot. The preferred knot's an FG knot, and essentially they work like a Chinese finger. So they're the slimmest knot you can tie, and they work like a Chinese finger, so the braid grips the top of the leader. So if you're looking at doing this style of fishing, talk to your local tackle guys or jump online and check out the FG knot. For a starter, they can be a little bit difficult to get your head around, so they do need a bit of practice, but once you get the hang of it, you'll be away. So typical setups that we'd use, this setup here, I've got a Yamaha 7'6" casting rod. So this one comes out of Japan, and I've got a little Saltiga 5000 on here. One thing with stick baiting too is that you will get high speed reels and kind of standard speed reels. A lot of stick baiting we do with high speed reels, and the reason for that is because it'll pick more line up, so you can actually keep in touch with that slack line a lot faster, and it'll allow you to work your lures faster when you want to. So in this case, this is a high speed reel, but you don't have to use them, but spin reels is the key for this style of fishing. In terms of seasonality for stick baiting, what we're looking at is there isn't really one. These can be fished all year round, but what we do find is that the kingfish will be feeding on different bait sources. So at certain times of the year they can be on squid, other times they're on pilchards, jack mackerel. It can depend, and that's one of the things that's real specific to where you're fishing, and a lot of that's about local knowledge. Obviously stick baits can be a lot different in size too, so if you're fishing an area where they're feeding on kahawai, you need to be up around the size that they're feeding on. If they're feeding on anchovies, which are this big, you need to be on the size that they're feeding on. We talked earlier about wooden ones versus kind of molded plastic ones. Wooden ones can range right up to the $300 plus mark. They're handmade in Japan. Everything's hand carved, hand painted, you name it. It doesn't mean they'll catch more fish. They usually will swim very well, but it doesn't mean you have to spend those type of dollars. So your kind of plastic molded ones that come pre-rigged in the stores will quite often do just as good a job, especially if they're feeding. When the wooden ones come into their own is when it's a little bit harder. And the reason for that is they just have a little bit better tuning to them. So stick baiting's wicked fun. You know, if you're tired of catching snapper or want a real challenge, this style of fishing is such good fun. Like I said, you see everything happen in front of you, you see the king smash the baits, and you know, it just looks good, everything about it's blingy, but it's wicked fun. If you're really interested in getting into this and catching kingies on this type of gear, don't hesitate to come down and see us, or alternatively, you know, go into your local tackle guys and have a chat to them. But you know, I recommend this. We do it all the time and you will have a ball.